So one of the things when it comes to employee reviews, you want to think about it before it's time to happen. So when you create the job, you should be thinking about, what is this job going to be measured on? How does it help my company, right? And that's all part of the job formation process. I'm hiring this executive assistant to help me do these things.
Welcome back to the Seven Figure Educator Podcast. I am super excited to dive into a conversation with Barbara Mason, CEO of Career Pathways and HR consultant. So this is a conversation that you have got to listen to, particularly if you are growing your team, if you are afraid to hire, and particularly if you are afraid to hire an employee. This is a must listen to conversation because we are going to break down the role of an HR consultant, how they could support you in your business, and what HR looks like for a seven-figure business. So go ahead. I want you to buckle up. I want you to listen in closely and get out your notebook to catch all of the gems we're going to be throwing during this episode. Let's get into it. All right, so let's jump into this conversation. And today is going to be an HR conversation. And I'm really excited to have this conversation because growing a seven-figure business means you need to grow team, my friends. You need to have not just a team, but you need to have an employee or a few. And so I really wanted to demystify the employee conversation, and what better way to do so than to have an HR expert, Barbara Mason, here with us to really be able to break this down for us. So Barbara, first off, thank you for joining us and being here today.
Glad to be here.
And so first, share with us your experience and journey in HR so that way people know a little bit about your background.
Yeah, absolutely. So I tell people I'm a real life HR person. I don't just play one on TV. So I went to school for HR. I got my degree in HR, and I have 20 years of HR experience in corporate. So I worked for multiple Fortune 500 companies. I was an HR executive. And so I did that for 20 years before starting my own business.
I don't know if we've ever talked about this. So before I was going to be a teacher, I actually applied to a Master's of Human Resources program.
Wow.
And I got accepted, but then I decided to follow another life calling and became a teacher. And so there was like a little short moment in my life where I was going to go into HR. And so I'd like to think that I have a really fond, connection to HR because of the work that you all do. So let's just, for the sake of, our audience, let's define HR, define human resources. So how do you define human resources?
So I define it as anything that's dealing with your people. So if you have a business, an organization, nonprofit, no matter the size, anything dealing with your people. So that's how you get them, hiring them. How do you keep them? That's culture. How do you train them? Learning and development. And even when they offboard, when they retire, when you have to terminate, anything with your people, benefits, it's all under HR.
And so I think it's interesting because, for many entrepreneurs who've worked in 9 to 5, they're familiar with the HR department. Right. And then when you create your own business, it's like, where your HR department at?
Right.
And so you're an HR consultant. That is your business, is you provide HR services. So what is an HR consultant? So I think most of us have a frame of reference of the HR department at our 9 to 5 or at our last job. But now when we move into entrepreneurship, why might I work with an HR consultant? What are the things you might be able to help me with?
Yeah. So I'm your HR department. That's what I am. And so it's just like what you imagine in corporate. You have people that can take care of all those people things for you, help you strategize, help you hire. That is what we do. So as an HR consultant, I am your HR partner for your business. So it's having like your own personal HR department.
So what might be some of the things that you support entrepreneurs with? So let's kind of break down, when you say you could be our HR department, what does that actually mean or look like?
Yeah. So one of the things that we do is help with strategy. And what that looks like is we talk about, who do you need to hire? Who do you need to hire first? What's the priority? Also, what do you need to pay them? Because that's really important. We talk about culture. So when you think about, as an entrepreneur, they're talking about their core values, their mission, their vision. But there's a cultural component. How do you want to run your company? What are your policies that you want to have? How do you want to treat people? We help with all of that. Then you get people and you start to have issues, right? So what do you do when there's conflict in the workplace? What do you do when there are unique situations and you don't have a policy for it, but you need to handle the situation? Someone is pregnant or someone has a disability or something like that. So any of those types of things we help with, even down to just how do I pick the right person? How do I interview? One other thing is also around leadership capability, because many entrepreneurs, they've worked in corporate, but they haven't been leaders, or they've been leaders in corporate, but they don't know how to lead their team. So I'll always say, once you hire them, you must lead them. It's not just I hire them, they're going to come work, and then I don't have to exhibit leadership. You have to have leadership. So we help with that too.
I'm so excited to have you here on the Seven Figure Educator podcast. And this is just an appetizer to what's waiting for you inside of our broader community, the Seven Figure Educator community, and the perfect opportunity for you to be able to dive into that amazing, dope community is at my 3-day live event. And you've guessed it, it is called Seven Figure Educator Live. It goes down once a year in Atlanta, Georgia, and I would absolutely love to have you in the room. It's 3 days of content, community, and fellowship. I can guarantee this is like no other event that you have been to before. I don't even call it a conference because we are litter than a conference. So to join us, go ahead, run to the show notes and grab your ticket at sevenfigureeducator.com, and we will see you in Atlanta. I have to say that as someone who, prior to being a full-time entrepreneur, was a principal, my mind was blown and being in lots of entrepreneur spaces and realizing how many people became entrepreneurs and previously hadn't managed people.
Absolutely. And don't want to. But that's your job. I just want to be the CEO. But see, that's leadership.
Right. And what's fascinating, and this is why, I say that there's so many parallels between education and entrepreneurship, is because, as a teacher, as a principal, like, you had no choice but to lead people.
Right.
Like, even if you were just a classroom teacher, not just a classroom teacher, but as a classroom teacher, like, you're leading a whole class of kids. As a high school math teacher, we got class jobs, we delegating, somebody needs to get up and pass out the papers. Okay, who's going to go ahead and collect these things? Yes. Like, there's a level of leadership that you have to exhibit. And there's some teachers who are leading what's called a PLC, a professional learning community. So they're leading their peers, or they're leading on their hallway. And so there's so many different experiences that educators are having in effectively leading people that is drastically setting them up as an entrepreneur to run an effective business simply by having that experience of leadership.
Right. But think about the entrepreneurs who are not educators and just a great citizen at work.
Right.
And now you have a business.
Right. So, okay. So let's kind of unpack some HR things. So first off, let's define the difference between a contractor and an employee. So from an HR perspective, what is the difference between those two? Okay,
that's a great question, one that I get all the time. So a contractor is just that they are there for usually a specified period of time. They are working, they're a subject matter expert. So you contract them to do a thing for a price, and they do it in the way that they want to because they have a business, and this is what I do. An employee is someone who works for you. You supply their training, you supply whatever they need, you set their hours, you set their pay. And so that's the difference. So when you have a contractor, you're not telling them when to come to work. You're contracting them out. So if you think about if you're getting married and you hire a photographer, that photographer does not work for you. They have their own business. They have a contract that says your wedding is on this date at this time, and they're going to be there, and this is the price. They do the wedding, you get pictures, we're done, we're finished, right? Contract ended. If it's an employee, then you tell them, hey, I want you to use this kind of camera. I'm going to buy the camera. I'm going to do all this stuff. And so there's lots of rules and stipulations about what you can do with a contractor versus an employee. So think about control, no control.
I think that's really important to delineate, because I think there are some people who, because of their mindset, they are afraid to hire an employee. So they hire a contractor, but they're trying to treat them like an employee
all the time.
And so what are some of the no-nos of when you have a contractor, if you do these things, that would be like treating them like an employee, which is actually a no-no.
Yes. So telling them what time to come to work, giving them extra bonus pay, treating them like an employee by giving them their own computer. What else? Making sure that they get the things that your other employees get. So if you have bonuses or perks, or we're going to have a team dinner, inviting them to the team dinner, that type of thing. Giving them performance feedback is one. Like having a conversation and giving them a review, having them sign a handbook. All of those things are for employees. They're not for contractors.
So when would you say, and given your expertise, when should someone consider moving from contractors to an employees?
I always say that when your company is making at least $1 million in revenue, you need to start, if you have only contractors, you need to start transitioning to employees. And here's the reason why. A contractor serves a purpose. And when you're first starting out, because your income and your revenue may fluctuate, it's easy to get a contractor and you can kind of off and on, it can be seasonal. But once you have consistent revenue, you're going to need consistent work. And with a contractor, they work when they want to. And they have other clients. And you get to a point in your business where you want them all to yourself. And when you start to feel that tug, like, hey, I asked Jessica, and Jessica's like, hey, I'm going to get to that tomorrow because I'm working on another client, and something rises up in you, it's time to hire your own employee. And so usually around from a revenue standpoint, usually around, I would say $750 to $1 million, you can usually afford your first employee on a regular basis.
You just basically named my exact experience of when I decided to hire my first employee, because I was actually probably at around $500,000. And at that time, I was in school full time and I knew I was going to go full time. And so I was making my best effort to hire in advance of when I knew I was going to need the person. And so the first position that I decided to hire as a full-time employee was an executive assistant. So to kind of create the runway and pathway to do that is I hired a VA part-time and was transparent with them of like, okay, that my goal is to bring someone on full-time when I graduate full-time here in a few months. So basically, if you perform really well, this could be your opportunity.
Right.
And I had that experience where I call it the side chick experience.
Yes.
I felt like the side chick because you had other side pieces too, that you was out here, projects you were working on, and I had to get in the queue.
That's right.
And I felt that experience of if there was a deadline that I had set on Thursday at noon, and I got it at noon, I could tell you started this at 10 a.m. And now it was rushed. Now there's errors because I was in the queue. I can't control your time.
Absolutely.
And I had gotten to the point where I was like, I am no longer willing to wait. Like I need someone who's fully dedicated to my business. So what is some of when you think about entrepreneurs that you work with and that you support, what's typically the first position that they hire full-time as an employee?
Usually an executive assistant is one, or somebody in operations. Those are the two that I see the most, is an executive assistant or somebody that's going to be behind the scenes handling their automations, their technology, and things like that.
So what are some of the steps that, okay, so you named that 750K to 1 million for sure is like, you need to have a full-time employee. So what are some of the steps that someone would need to take in order to get ready to hire that full-time employee?
Yeah. So one of the things, and I think this is a perfect way to get an HR consultant at the first stop. So when you think about when do I need an HR consultant, I think this is a perfect opportunity to at least talk to someone in HR and talk about your business, where you're headed, so they can help identify and validate that this is the right person you need to hire. Because everybody doesn't need an EA for their first hire. That's what most people do, but that's not necessarily what they need, right? So from an HR standpoint, we sit down and we talk to you about where is your business now? Where are you trying to go? And then what are the obstacles that's getting you away from more revenue, right? So is it the administrative piece? Is it sales? Is it something else? So that way you identify the right person for the first hire. Because what's going to happen is if you get the wrong person, then it's like, oh, well, see, I knew I shouldn't have hired anybody.
Right.
But you didn't do your due diligence. You just looked on social media and saw, oh, well, everybody hires an EA first, so that's what I'll do.
Or a social media manager.
Or a social media manager. And so identifying the right person or the right role is key. The other steps is figure out what your budget is. Some people cannot afford to hire full-time to pay the wages they need to pay. So maybe you start off part-time. Like you said, give them a runway and let them know, hey, we're going to ramp this position up to full-time within the next 3 months because maybe your budget doesn't allow it. But you bring them on, your revenue increases, and then you can bring them on full-time. So definitely know your budget. Also know if you want remote or in person, and do you want them in your state or another state? Because different states have different laws.
Ooh, let's talk about that.
So before you jump off in the deep, again, make sure that you do your due diligence. And that's why it's important to have somebody in HR that's helping to guide you.
Because let me tell you where I don't want to hire: California.
Yes.
And why would I say that? Why would I in California or New York? But from a HR standpoint, why might someone be thoughtful of if they're going to hire someone in California?
Because California is a very employee-friendly state. And if you are a small business, there are so many rules that you may not have the infrastructure, the revenue, and all of that to be able to support an employee in California. It is very employee focused. So there's way more rules and regulations than it is in any other state.
Are there any other states that are similar or comparable to California in terms of the regulation?
Yes, New York and Washington State.
And what would be some examples of some of the regulation that is an additional layer in some of those states?
Yeah, so one of the things is when it comes to vacation, those states mandate that you have to give vacation, that you have to give sick time. So again, if you're a small business and you're just starting out, you may not have the infrastructure or the wherewithal to be able to give sick time and be able to pay that out. It also mandates that you pay out vacation at the end of termination. So again, if they have 80 hours in the bank and then you terminated them or they've left, you got to pay that out. Also, California, you have to pay them on the last day worked. So you got to get them a physical check. Like, it's all the rules. So there's some few things that that are like that.
Which is why you need to have an HR consultant, right?
Yes.
Because people will then just out here like willy-nilly, almost like legal Zoom, but the HR version.
Right.
And then there's so many intricacies that are underneath this that then you find yourself in a situation where, and I think part of the reframe is understanding that when you are hiring an employee, that is actually a legal decision.
Absolutely.
And so like you have to be really clear around the legal implications. And I say this not to scare people, but the reality is like, that is the responsibility of being a CEO. Absolutely. Is you have to be aware of the legal implications of now having an employee on board. So,
but there's also legal implications for you to have a contractor treating them like an employee.
Let's talk about that. So what do you mean?
So you can be fined. So if you have a contractor that you are treating like an employee, you can be fined for that because because a lot of people don't want to hire an employee, one, because they feel like contractor's the easy button, but two, they're trying to avoid paying taxes. And the government knows that.
Ooh, child.
Because as a contractor, you don't have to pay taxes. They pay their own taxes. But yet you're treating them like an employee. So you're getting the benefit of them being an employee, so to speak, but you're not paying taxes. You can get fined for that.
It's wild out here. The way that it is wild out here. The way some people are trying to cut corners in their business, and those are the consequences of cutting corners, which is why it's so important to know these pieces. So let's talk a little bit in depth around some of the services and ways that you support folks through HR services. So let's start at the beginning, kind of as like the life cycle of a team member and employee at the recruitment process and the hiring process, because it was fascinating to me when I was in different entrepreneur, spaces. And mind you, I shared that I hired my first employee at $500,000. And it was just like this given that like people had to manage their own hiring process. I was like, I don't have time for this. Like, I do not have time to write a job posting. And I've never written a job post before because as a principal, HR did that. Right. I don't have time to source resumes, to look at resumes. I don't have time to be on the phone pre-screening folks. Like, to the fact that everybody just assumes it's a given that you have to do this. I was like, I ain't got time for this. Is there somebody else who could do this for me? So talk to us around like the done for you, DFY, recruitment of what does that actually look like when you're working with the HR consultant? Yeah,
it looks like magic. That's what it looks like. It looks like magic in heaven. So basically what we do is we do it all for you. And so when it comes to recruiting, we sit down and your only intake is for the job intake call. You tell us what you need, what you're looking for, what you're going to pay, what type of person. So from a competency standpoint, technically, as well as cultural fit. You give us like your perfect recipe of a candidate, and then we literally take it from there. We write the job posts and we source the candidates. We screen all the applicants. We do 3 levels of interviews, and then we present to you the top 2 people for you to interview. And then you select who you want. Then we pick it back up from you and do all the new hire paperwork, the offer, and all of the other stuff. It saves you at least 30 to 50 hours of your time. Easily. Because when you think about, most people go for an executive assistant first. You can easily get 200 resumes for an executive assistant.
God, right.
So can you imagine sifting through 200 pieces of paper?
No. I
trying
can't.
to find, but it's what we do each and every day. And so we have a process. We're efficient. We have a system, and we know what to look for.
Right. So talk to me through. So one of the things that also comes to mind from an HR standpoint is, well, back up. The very first thing that I realized when I was going to hire employees was, oh, I need an employee handbook.
Yes.
And so talk to us around, what is an employee handbook, why you need an employee handbook, the purpose of an employee handbook, and the role you play in that.
Yeah. So we do all the handbooks for you. So the purpose of a handbook is so that you have a repository, a documented way that says this is how our company runs. So it should include all the federal laws and all the state laws. Like, that's a given. But then the third piece is, what are your laws, right? How do you want to run your company? The things that you have purview over. And so it's really important, because when there is going to be an issue, because there's going to be an issue where the employee is going to feel differently about something that's going on in the company. And somebody's going to have to decide, okay, well, what is the letter of the law? You need to have the letter of the law written down, right? So there is no guesswork. You need to have it written down. This is how we do business. So if someone leaves or they want to sue you, you have a framework that's written down and say, this is how we run our company. So it's very important for legal reasons to have a handbook. Also, just from a practical standpoint, people like guidelines. They like boundaries. They want to know, okay, where can I play? And you give them the guardrails, right? And it's a sign of a good company that has structure and that has purpose and that knows exactly where they're headed. So you should not have an employee without a handbook. You just shouldn't. So even when it comes down to, think about bereavement leave. That's one that many entrepreneurs never think about until something happens.
Yes.
Right?
That was me.
Until something happens and you're thinking, okay, well, what did they do in corporate? But it's your company. And when it comes to bereavement, there's only a few states that mandate what you have to do, like California obviously does, right? But when it doesn't, what do you want to do as a company? How does it embody your culture, right? So this is where, as an entrepreneur, you get to kind of create the culture that you want to have, because the federal law and the state law doesn't say that you have to do it a certain way.
Right.
I had a client, this is very telling. I had a client who had an employee who had a stillborn at 7 months pregnant.
Ooh, oh my goodness.
She was devastated. The employee, the client, and she said, my policy, because she had just gotten a handbook from, a standard, off the shelf, 3 days. That did not feel right. Right. And so we worked through that situation. We talked about, okay, what feels right? What is sustainable? Because what you do for one, typically you got to do for somebody else.
Right.
But what feels right with your culture, right? This is a classic example when HR is your partner.
Right.
Because you have the latitude to do something, but you want somebody else to be thinking along with you about, okay, how do we do it the right way and how can we sustain this?
Right.
Right. Because that's not in a handbook. I mean, that's not in the manual.
Right.
An employee who has a stillborn baby at 7 months.
Right.
But in corporate, it's going to be whatever it's going to be, because it's 5,000, 10,000, 50,000 employees.
Right.
But in a small business, you don't have to do it that way.
Right. Which that's so powerful, because, I say often that my mission that is not necessarily on the website, but is really important to me, is that I'm creating a company that's safe for Black women.
Yes.
Which means that if I were to be consistently relying on my memory files of policies in corporate, that I'm actually not able to create an environment that's safe for Black women, because they're not created for Black women. Policies and organizations and corporations are not created for us. But in order for me to do that, I have to know what is actually required from a state standpoint in order to be able to then make decisions of what does it actually mean for our company. And I think what's been really helpful in the ways I've been able to leverage your expertise is being able to come to you and say, like, okay, this is the type of situation that I have, and here's what I'm thinking from an HR standpoint. Like, what are the policies that I need to know about? What implications might I be thinking about later on down the line? Because what you named is when a company is growing, you have to make the decision, not just from today in your current team, but is this a policy that if your team were to double or triple, that you'd still want to be the policy? Absolutely. And so just thinking futuristically and long term around bereavement, because that happened to me where I had an employee handbook and realized we didn't have a bereavement policy. And I realized that when someone on our team had experienced a death in the family, where I'm like, okay, so I hit you up and was like, what is the requirement?
Right.
And because whatever my decision is, I want to make sure from an HR standpoint that I'm meeting whatever the state's policies or mandates are, but also having an opinion of this is what, from a culture standpoint, what I'd want to put in place. What is your response to people who, because I feel like I see this question that pops up all the time, and every time I see it, I cringe because I'm like, you do not need to be asking the internet. You need to be asking an HR consultant. But when people are like, how much do I pay X position? So when people ask those questions from an HR standpoint, what's the actual process and step that you all go through to support entrepreneurs and identifying how much to pay a particular position?
Yeah, some things you should not ask the internet, and that is one of them. So one of the things we do is that we partner with companies and do compensation studies. And so what that is, in a very simple way, is that there's a lot of data out there that's gathered from across the United States, regionally, locally, and across the United States that says this position, based on the education requirements, the skill set, whatever it is, pays this much. So there is what we call a market for that job, right? There's a min, a max, and a mid. And so we look at that data to help you determine what you should pay. The reason why that's important is because when you put your job out there, you're putting it out there for the world to see. And so you're competing with other companies, whether you know it or not, right? And so if I'm hiring a software engineer and the average rate is $75,000 a year and you put yours out there at $50,000 a year, well, guess who's not going to get anybody? Right. Or you're going to get the bottom of the... So it's important for you to know what the data says, right? Because that's at least your baseline. And then you can layer in whatever benefits and other things that you want to add into it to make it a competitive or attractive package. So it's not just picking a number in the sky.
Right. Right. Which is, it's almost, this is why it's like so fascinating, because it's like the meta moments where it's like, you don't approach that with pricing.
Right.
So you shouldn't be approaching that with a salary.
Exactly.
Like,
you don't
of just
a number, and nor you say, well, this is what I can pay. Well, your budget comes after you find the market data.
Right.
Do you have the budget for this?
Right.
Not, this is my budget.
Right.
And this is what I'm paying.
Right. And I think that's also a really great example of one of the ways in which, being able to think innovatively around HR policies, because some of the conversations we've had and the ways in which you support us with recruitment, where I was like, part of my value of equity and justice is I want to put the salary on the job description.
Yes. And
I've had lots of experiences personally and in my network with other people where it's like, you don't know how much the job is paying until you go through interview 3 or 4. And then you find out like, I'm making more now. So why did I even go through this process? So
that's also when entrepreneurs do their own hiring, because when we do it as an HR consultant, we always have the money conversation up front. Because one of the worst things you can do is to go along with the candidate and you love them and you cannot afford them.
That part.
You do not want to do that. You don't want to love somebody that you cannot afford.
Right. Right.
Afford them, then love them.
Come on. Come on. So another example of how you've been able to support me and my company that I think is often not talked about is performance reviews.
Yes.
And so and it's so wild because it's like you have this experience and like in a 9-to-5 in a corporation as someone who was previously a principal. I did performance reviews all the time. And then I remember having my first employee and we were approaching her 1-year mark. And then I realized like, oh, I need to be doing an employee review, but I ain't got no form. But what's supposed to be on my form? I got to create my employee review process.
Yes.
So talk to us a little bit around like how you think about employee reviews, how an HR consultant can support you in actually structuring your employee review process.
Yeah, absolutely. And so one of the things when it comes to employee reviews, you want to think about it before it's time to happen. So when you create the job, you should be thinking about, what is this job going to be measured on? How does it help my company, right? And that's all part of the job formation process I'm hiring this executive assistant to help me do these things. Well, some of those things are the metrics, right? When it comes to year one, how efficient were they at managing your calendar? What was their attention to detail? What was their organization? So it all kind of dovetails into one another. So when it comes to performance reviews, think about what you're measuring, right? Think about what are the goals of the position, and did you make it known before the review?
Right.
Don't have a review and they didn't even know what their goals were.
Right.
And so it starts with the job.
Right.
And then, okay, these are the things I want you to work on for this year. And it should have a component where it's business, but also personal development. Mm-hmm. So part of the review is talking to your employee about what is it that you want to be, in the company? What are your career goals? What do you want to work more on? Hey, I want to do better at public speaking, or I'm not really good at Excel, but you have me in this job where it's really Excel heavy. You put that on their performance review. For the next year, I want you to take 2 classes. So when the next year comes, that's a metric.
Right.
Did you go to the classes or did you not?
Right.
Did you, up your attention to detail, whatever the case may be. So having some clear, defined goals, objectives, on what those things are, and then have a way to have that conversation with the employee. And I really like having the employee assess themselves.
Yep.
I think that is really key for a couple of reasons. One, as a CEO, you're not going to remember all the great things that your person does. You're just going to know, oh yeah, they did good. But you're going to forget in February they did do that.
Right.
They're not going to forget.
Right.
They're going to remember. So when you ask them to say, hey, give me a list of your accomplishments, or use the form and rate yourself, it's a very good conversation and an eye-opening experience, and a great way for you to say, okay, you see yourself here. I see you here.
Right.
Okay, you gave yourself this. This is not how I see you. Let's talk about it.
Right.
It gives a very good conversation instead of it being a one-sided, you're coming to the mountaintop to get the review.
Right.
It should be a conversation.
Which, again, I think is the reason why people need to partner with the HR consultant, because how you structure your employee review process impacts your culture.
Yes.
And so, what does it say about a company that includes a self-assessment as a part of their employee review process? It says that we value your opinion. It says that this is a partnership. It says that from a power structure standpoint, we're side by side when we're talking about your feedback.
Yes.
It says so many things. And an HR consultant can take your vision of what you want to be true for your culture and your values and actually help you create a process that reflects that.
And I think feedback is important as well, because one of the things we also help with, many entrepreneurs do not know how to give feedback. And so one of the things I do with my clients when we're talking about performance reviews, and let's say we're doing yours. Okay, tell me about Erica. I said, just tell me about Erica. No, we don't have to write anything down. Just tell me. And I just let them talk. Well, tell me what you think she should improve on. They tell me. What do you think she's good at? They tell me. I said, okay, let's write it down. Or you tell me. And what they say versus what they said back here that's 2 completely different things. Because when you talked about she needed to have more attention to detail, you were really frustrated. But yet you just told me in words, your mean expectations, and it was a very different message. So do you want her to improve or do you not? Most entrepreneurs do not know how to give courageous, critical feedback. They will wimp out in a heartbeat. And I mean it. And I'm like, but you're frustrated. You got to give the feedback.
I tell you who knows how to give good feedback. A former principal. Okay? Because listen, I'm the right one and the wrong one. Okay? Let me tell you who knows how to send a directive email. A former principal. Let me tell you who knows how to give really great, juicy, meaningful, feedback. A former principal, right? So just going back to the parallels of how educators are uniquely positioned to be entrepreneurs. What would be some of the biggest mistakes and missteps that you see entrepreneurs make when it comes to HR structures?
One is not having an HR person in your back pocket. So just like you have your media person, your marketing person, your research person, you should have an HR person on your team, even if it's somebody that you use on a routine or occasional basis. It doesn't have to be a full-time, I have a full-time HR person, but like having an HR consultant. I think that's 1. 2, waiting too late to hire. Moving in fear. Not paying people what they're worth. Not knowing what your culture is. I could go on and on. Those are the key mistakes that I see. And then leadership. It's like you get the people in and it's like you don't know how to lead them. There's no employee engagement. There's no check-ins to see how things are going. You can't even define your culture. And so the employees can't define the culture.
So my final question for you is, we'll do a little sentence starter that sometimes I do as like icebreakers of, getting to know people. And the sentence starter is call me when. So when should people call you and reach out to you?
As soon as you get ready to hire.
Mm.
As soon as you get ready to think that you're going to have a team. As soon as you think I'm not going to be a solopreneur anymore. That's when you should call me.
Mm.
So even before you hire, when you decide I'm not going to be a solopreneur, but I'm going to hire one day, that's when you should call me.
Thank you so much for joining us and providing so much advice and wisdom. How can people get in touch with you?
Yes, you can find me on Instagram and LinkedIn under Barbara Mason. Also, you can go to my website, careerpathwaysconsulting.com.
You can also find her on YouTube. Do you want to share your YouTube channel? Because I'm thoroughly intrigued by her other life that she's living, which is the life of a brilliant farmer. Do you want to share your YouTube channel? Because it's fascinating.
Sure. My alter ego is that I'm a farmer as well as an HR consultant. So I have a YouTube channel, A Gardener's Journey Homestead. So if you love to garden, grow food, or you just want to learn how to garden, go follow me on YouTube.
Thank you so much for joining us, Barbara. It's been an extreme pleasure. And also just thank you for all the ways in which you supported me in business and being able to grow my team and support and develop my team. So thank you all for joining us on this episode of the 7-Figure Educator Podcast. Let me know in the comments your biggest takeaways. Give me some feedback. If you enjoyed this episode, leave a review and hit that subscribe or follow button so that way you know when the next episode drops. Until next time, family, we'll see you on the next episode.